各位来到中间之声，中国和澳大利亚的播客访谈节目。Welcome to the middle。此节目是从 2SER 广播电台播出。今天的话题有关澳中美关系，我们会研究这种复杂的三方关系。
Welcome to The Middle, the show about China and Australia and their friends. We are coming to you from 2SER studios in the heart of Sydney on the traditional lands of the Gadigal people of the Aurora Nation. My name is Peter Fray, the co-director of the Centre for Media Transition, and joining me today is my co-presenter and my esteemed colleague from the University of Technology, Sydney, Warning Sun. Hello, Warning. How are you?
Pretty good, Peter. Hey, Peter, can you tell us why we decided to call this show The Middle?
Well, thank you for asking, Warning. There are four important reasons. Firstly, the obvious. Australia is increasingly caught in the middle between the US and China. Secondly, China is, of course, the Middle Kingdom. Thirdly, many people get stuck in the middle of the debate about China and Australia, and we're here to help them, hopefully. And fourthly, we wish to see if there isn't a productive middle path in this often hot and divisive debate.
Well, maybe there is another reason. I would suggest if we can become a little bit philosophical. How about Confucius' idea of the golden middle, 中庸之道, or Aristotle's idea of the doctrine of the golden mean?
Wow, Wanning, I'm always learning new things from you. I really am.
There you
It's
go.
great to be with you. Today's episode is, in fact, all about the US, China, and Australia. That tricky tripartite relationship. We're exploring this complicated and delicate three-way, and Wanning, there's been quite a lot of fuss recently about it, hasn't there?
Well, absolutely. I think we've just gone through a very tumultuous time in terms of China, US, and the Australian relationships. First, the US and China nearly had a clash at the South China Sea. And then Mike Pence made that very famous and controversial speech at the Hudson Institute. So, and that was considered to be a declaration of the Second Cold War. So it's clear the U.S. is leaning on Australia to pledge its allegiance.
And back home, we have elections looming, and the coalition government clearly needs and wants and desires the Chinese vote. The Prime Minister recently paid a visit to Hurstville in the federal Sydney seat of Banks, pledging a commitment to foster Sino-Australian relations. And in the meantime, the Prime Minister is believed to time his announcement to follow the US and then the move of the embassy to Jerusalem. The Australian has published an analysis echoing support for Pence, while China Daily, that's China's state media, has issued warnings to Australia and Japan not to side with the United States. So this is a perfect time for this discussion.
Absolutely. And we have in the studio today two most qualified people to talk about these issues. Today we have Associate Professor Jingdong Yuan from the Center for International Security Studies at Sydney University, and Professor John King of Sydney University. So Jingdong and John, welcome to the studio.
Thank you.
Thank you, Wanning.
Could you also tell us, Jingdong first, why are you interested in this subject area?
Well, I follow regional security, of course, and also great power relations. So you cannot think of a more consequential relationship than the U.S.-China relationship.
Indeed.
John?
And John, what brings you to the China?
I became interested after coming home, after a very long time away in Europe. After coming home, I became interested in the China question because of, I declare a very passionate commitment to this multiculturalism experiment which is happening here. And we have 1.25 million Chinese Australian citizens. Their voices are not often heard publicly. And of course, they find themselves now entangled in this tension between the so-called rise of China and this American bellicosity, let's say.
Okay, so to some specifics, Jingdong. The Australian says the Mike Pence speech sets out a new approach and adopts a more confrontational policy towards China. So what does that mean for Australia? And should Australia hedge or wedge to quote the title of one of your many fine books.
Right. I think Australia, it would be wise for Australia to hedge for the moment, because I think there are a number of important facts that we need to be aware of. Number one is China is very, very important for Australia in its bottom line. Mm-hmm. That is economic prosperity, employment, and so this is very, very important. Number two, Australia is situated in the Indo-Pacific, where China is rising, is becoming a dominant power. Right? So that fact must be taken into consideration. Thirdly, which is where the challenge is that Australia has a solid and over 7 decades, even longer, alliance relationship with the United States. Australia has always depended on a great power for its security, because by itself it just is not capable, or both in terms of manpower, in economic terms.
Too far away.
Yeah, so it's very, very difficult. So how to balance its economic interest and the reality that Australia is part of Asia or Indo-Pacific, where China is emerging as a great power. On one hand, and its solidarity and alliance relationship with the U.S., it's a very, very tough challenge for Canberra.
Well, John, I read Richard McGregor, from the Lois Institute, who's written an article yesterday saying that Pence wants to have a divorce from China. And so when U.S. and China get a divorce, what should Australia do?
Well, I think we should look behind the words, Wan-Ying, because there are various interpretations of this Pence speech at the Hudson Institute. You mentioned it before. Some say it is equivalent to Churchill's Iron Curtain speech, 1946. I happen to think that analogy is overdrawn, partly because Pence was playing to an American audience. I also think it's overdrawn because it overestimates the power of the United States to decide things. And one of the ideas I've been trying to develop and to put out publicly is that we are witnessing the decline of the American empire. There are all kinds of signs of that. And so this speech, rather than being a trumpet blast of strength, might well be a kind of bleat and a cry of weakness.
So perhaps, John, for different reasons, when the China Daily says that Australia and the US and its allies shouldn't be drawn into this sort of Cold War paranoia, in fact, the Cold War paranoia is a kind of American fiction in this case.
Yes, and I think Jing Dong is right in this respect, that some hedging in Australian foreign policy is very important. I also think that this talk of a new Cold War underestimates the pragmatism option, let's call it. That Australia, as a medium-sized power, wealthy, multicultural, a laboratory experiment in the Asia-Pacific region, and so on, has room for maneuver in matters of higher education, in matters of agriculture, and investment, and so on. And being clever in as it were, playing off the Americans and the Chinese is something that's in pretty short supply at the moment in politics, but it is, I think, a future option.
Well, just before we go to Jing Dong, I mean, being clever, is that an option for us right now? As you say, there's not a lot of evidence that we can play off the two.
Oh, it's not an oxymoron.
Oh, sorry.
That's for sure. But what I mean is that there is a sort of stalemate at the moment, I think, right, in official politics, and there's a flip-flopping. There are moments when Australian politicians speak exactly like Mike Pence. And there are other moments, you mentioned it in your introduction, Peter, where there's a kind of pragmatism, and like we welcome our alliance with China and so on. So what is needed, I think, is a reimagining of our relationship, and it's Stephen Fitzgerald, I think, who may have been on this program already, who I think is a leading exponent of that pragmatic vision that requires cleverness.
So obviously, there is a lot of contradiction, tension here between, in the government's policies, foreign policies. So we've talked about Australia being caught in the middle, and you said that it's very difficult for Australia. But are there any concrete things that Australia can do to negotiate this space?
Well, this is a very good question. Also, certainly a challenge for the government. I think Prime Minister Morrison's visit during speech in Hurstville is part of this slow and gradual so-called reset in Australia-China relations after the previous, I think, 18 months of very, growing hostility and animosity between China and Australia because of this foreign interference and all the rest. So, on the one hand, this is a welcome interlude in this otherwise very strange relationship. And certainly Morrison recognized the Chinese community's contribution to Australians' development over 100 years, even longer. And he also recognized that the importance of China in terms of economic development and even, for regional stability. But the important challenge is how you can implement policies that will reflect this or reinforce this so-called reset. Of course, I think there are a number of things Canberra can do, and think in the past, Australian government has actually very successfully managed this very delicate trilateral relationship. So I think the number one thing, the first and foremost fact is that the Australia should always approach either its relationship with the U.S. or China from the fundamental interest of Australia's peace and prosperity. So Australia national interest should set the premise of any specific policy.
Does that put Australia first?
Yeah, Australia interest should be the anchor, because sometimes when as John mentioned, that the politician very strong language and statement is as if they are catering or pampering the Americans, and as if the alliance is so important that Australia has to, from time to time, demonstrate, even though we have this growing economic tie with China, we're still very loyal to our old friends in the United States. Okay, so I think that's not the right way to conduct foreign policy. It should be, what are Australia's national interests? Certainly is safety of Australian citizens, security of its borders, and then economic prosperity. So if you take these three facts into any consideration, and then you will find that Australia-U.S. alliance is only one factor, although very important factor, in this whole overall consideration and so forth.
Yeah, okay.
So that would be the basis to derive and develop pragmatic approaches.
Okay. We'll flip over to John now. John, just before I know you're going to respond to that too, and build on that. But also, let's push forward a little bit. So we do have a federal election looming, as we mentioned. One, do you think this issue, this debate, is going to feature? Is it a part of our political narrative in a kind of populist way now? Is it becoming so? Secondly, what does that kind of post-election, I mean, again, we're getting into crystal ball gazing territory here, but post-election, this pragmatic, building on what Jing Tong just said, what does that look like?
I've no doubt that that this issue of Australia, China, US, and the fate of our region is going to smolder on, And that's because this is not such an orthodox way of talking, but that's because I think we have a region that is now under the influence increasingly of two empires. And one of them is showing signs of weakening, the American, and the rise of China. It's not a popular word to use, 帝国, empire, to describe what is happening to the expansion.
It's not a popular word in China.
And the word empire, interestingly, is not popular in the United States either. And yet Australia is entangled in those dynamics. That's one reason why I think this issue will not go away, and whichever government we have in the early next year, in 2019, will have to deal with this. The second thing is that I think I'm less sympathetic to old-fashioned talk of national interests. I mean, I think that in the region, what we have is a kaleidoscope of different institutions and dynamics and industries and movements and so on, of people and of capital. So that Australia's role in the region has to, I think, by definition, involve a dynamic rebalancing of the rise of this new Chinese empire and a struggling American empire. And so it means that, cleverness in selected fields, higher education policy, renewable energy, but it also has to include, Jingdong didn't mention this, strategies for bringing greater accountability to cross-border institutions. We played an important role in the AIIB, and it was actually Prime Minister Abbott and diplomats who managed to win an accountability integrity unit inside that bank. Another issue that's developing is whether we want actively to support what might become a Chinese application to enter the Comprehensive Trans-Pacific Partnership. The difficulty there is that the recent trade deal signed between Mexico and Canada and the United States prohibits Mexico and Canada from entering into partnerships with powers that are not market economies. So Australia is going to have to negotiate that, and shying away from it is not an option.
You are listening to The Middle, the show that's dedicated to exploring the relationship between China and Australia. And today we're lucky enough to have both professors from Sydney University, Associate Professor Jingdong Yuan and Professor John King. Yes, over to you, Peter.
Do you agree then with the moves by this government, this federal government, to limit the influence or potential influence of the Chinese company Huawei?
I think, it has its legitimate security concerns.
Right.
But the way I think it manages Huawei is not the way you should, manage, because it sends a wrong signal to prospective foreign investors. And Australia is a country that is always in need of foreign capitals. Even in the case of Huawei, if you look at the UK, the UK and Sweden, these are the countries which have allowed Huawei to operate for a very, very long time. There are security protocols you can establish so you can separate, certainly protect your, critical infrastructure or security, but also still inviting capital and technology and to have the sort of Australia-China cooperation. That would be for the benefit of all of us.
Yeah.
Just to link up with Jingdong's remarks, it's important to remember that if you look at DFAT figures of foreign direct investment in Australia for 2017, US direct investment is around about 950 billion Australian dollars. Chinese investment is around 65 billion. That runs counter to what many journalists are saying, and certainly the talk of a China takeover. It's not true.
So you've been listening to The Middle with me, Peter Frey, and Wanning Sun. Our guest today, the esteemed strategic and defense analyst, Professor Jingdong Wan from the Center for International Security Studies at Sydney University, political science extraordinaire. Can I call you that? I know. Professor John Keane of Sydney University. We could talk for hours about this relationship, the relationship between the US, Australia, and China. But unfortunately, Wanning, we've only got time for maybe one, possibly two quick questions.
I do want to ask Jingdong one more question about spending on defense. Obviously, China spent a lot of money on defense. But we really don't know much about the thinking behind China's defense policy. So first of all, I'd like you to say a little bit about China's thinking behind its own defense spending. Secondly, could you say also a little bit about Australia's thinking behind Australia's defense spending, particularly in the new context of intensified tension, if you like, between the US and China?
Right. In terms of China's thinking behind its defense spending, that has been going on for the last 4 decades. And basically, on the one hand, you can think of defense modernization as part of the overall economic growth and economic development and the wealth creation. On the other hand, because of China is now so integrated into the global economy, now you have millions of Chinese people working overseas. You have billions of dollars of Chinese capitals invested in many foreign countries. So the new thinking on the defense spending is to strengthen the capabilities so that China can be in a position to protect its citizens, its foreign economic interest in overseas. So all of these require the sufficient but still reasonable input into the defense expenditure. So of course, people talk about the double-digit defense spending over the last 30, 40 years. But people have failed to recognize is that as a percentage of GDP, defense spending has been declining as a percentage. Now it's about under 2%. Not even...
The GDP has been growing so fast.
Yeah, GDP going so fast.
Yeah.
And then you have to think about, because China is entering into, older populations and there are healthcare, education. So there are a lot of public spending demands. So defense spending could only be a, increase at a measurable pace. And then to meet ever-growing sort of missions that China has. Now, with regard to Australia's defense expenditure, as I mentioned earlier, is primarily defending its sort of a maritime or territorial interests, but also is sort of in a supportive role in a broader U.S. military alliance system in the Indo-Pacific. Right, so it's an early warning, surveillance, but also in the cyber area, electronic warfare and communication. So where Australia has a particular niche and to support this overall strategy.
John, last question for you then. You recently wrote this article called One World, Two Empires. Is that right?
Yes.
Is China-US conflict inevitable? Now, I'm curious why you refer to these two countries as empires. And do you see the way that's how it was conducted in history?
An empire is technically a large state whose economic, governmental, cultural, and military power extends way beyond its borders, regardless of the niceties of talk of sovereignty. And we know from this great book by John Darwin called After Tamerlane that we've had many modern empires, all of them, with a couple of exceptions, failed very quickly. They typically failed, the ones that failed because they overstretched. They became too big for their own boots. And what I tried to say, picking up on that idea, which is very much a part of what I think is needed, this dynamic rebalancing of our relation with the United States and China. What I tried to say in this short piece is that actually it never happened before that two empires were global in reach and were entangled. The first genuinely global empire was not the British. It was actually the American, and it was born of victory in World War II. And it had a competitor, the Soviet Union. But they were not entangled, economically not entangled, militarily not entangled. That was the Cold War. What we now have with the collapse of the Soviet Union and Russia lurking around, it's true, and causing trouble and making moves in Syria and so on. Yeah. Yes, poisoning its opponents. Is we have this new dynamic in which, as each day passes, I think China counts as an empire. When you speak about this subject inside China, the word "diguo" is a bad word. It refers to the past, to the throwing off of colonization and empire. And there is sometimes talk of a big power. We're becoming a big power, a dark war, but generally an embarrassment about this word. Lots of talk of Tianxia, the world will live under one heaven. There is talk of intercultural communication. There's a dodging of the PowerPoint that this, when you look at the mega projects and you look at the role of CGTN and you look at the first bailing out of Chinese citizens in Libya and so on, you see something very big going on. And that's what I mean by empire. The question, I think, for Australia, for Australian politics and citizens, is what kind of empire will this be? I think it will be partly determined by the behavior of the United States. I don't think that the Thucydides trap, as it's called, is an iron law. The Thucydides, hard to say so early in the morning. The Thucydides trap is one where a rising power, it's said, always causes military conflict and it ends in war. It's empirically not the case. And it's still an open matter. But what kind of empire will China be, I think, is a great question for us. And I watch it as each day passes. I collect materials. I find it's a kaleidoscope of trends that don't add up. China is a good, decent, rule of law player in many cross-border institutions. Fazhi, they follow rule of law. In Xinjiang is violence and the suppression of Muslims. In Dubrovnik, to complete the picture and to show how contradictory it is, in Croatia, they're not only building this big bridge, thanks to European funding, it's not a big loan debt arrangement, but they're also doing joint patrols with police in the streets of Dubrovnik. I mean, these are symptoms of something very big going on. And it's not clear yet what kind of empire it will be. We hope it's cautious, and it has, may I say, like the British Empire, it had enough pluralism inside it to be stable, so that it allows certain things to happen that are quite at odds with what goes on inside China. This is all I think of.
So on that question, that very big question, which could be as another 3 or 4 shows, I suspect, what sort of empire will China be? We're going to have to wrap it up for this week. I'd like to thank very, very much our guests, Jin Dongguan coming and John Keane for being such wonderful guests. Thank you very much, both of you. And until next time, it's goodbye from me, Peter Frey, and Wanting Sun, my wonderful co-presenter, and a big thanks to our producer, Amy Lowe. Thanks very much for listening.